team of our employees have produced this new report, which is a response to what's going on. Why have we decided to present this report now without waiting for autumn? It just happens so that for a while we felt like prophets because the Valdai Club for a number of years have been publishing its annual reports about the status of the global politics, and we were always uh, criticized for being alarmists, for being too gloomy. And 2 years ago, we published a report which was called Living in a Crumbling World, in which we stated, as we thought back then, that the global order that we were used to and that we used to analyze in the previous decades was over. It was crumbling. It stopped functioning as it was supposed to function, and we were moving to a totally new reality when many old institutions and mechanisms are still there, but they don't work like they were supposed to work, and some of them begin to simply disappear. That particular Valdai report attracted a lot of attention. Many criticized it because they believed we were too gloomy in our descriptions, and there was this very interesting debate back then. In 2019, a year later, we developed that original thought, and we came to the conclusion that the global system is diving into anarchy, not in the sense of complete chaos, but the anarchy in this scholarly theoretical sense of the word, when all players begin to use only their own interests, only their own security ideas. It also led to some lively debates, and our Chinese colleagues were uh, bewildered by this term, anarchy, saying we shouldn't be pushing the world towards it. But what's happening today, starting with late winter and early spring this year, as we understand it, unfortunately confirmed everything that we was writing about uh, earlier. The world has really crumbled under this catalytic impact of the global pandemic, but not directly because of it. Whatever was happening, all those earlier trends that had been going on that we indicated, they got a new start, a new incentive, and we see how the global situation is changing in front of our very own eyes. It's not a uh, an immediate breakthrough. This is the continuation of what had started a while ago, but we believe that we have crossed the border of these processes no longer being manageable. And anyway, we published this report, and we hope to listen to your uh, criticism and the some positive comments. We have an excellent panel of speakers this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them as I give them the floor. But first of all, I'd like to ask my colleague and co-author, Timothy Bordachev, Program Director of the Valdai Club, to say a few words, because he was one of the leading authors of this report, and many of his ideas led us to this particular text. Thank you. I'm glad to be among such great intellectuals and political leaders. I won't be able to stay for this discussion for too long. The university demands that I attend another event later, so I apologize for that. Earlier this year, I got an impression that this anarchy was something that everyone was quite happy with. This was this multipolarity, diversity that everyone wanted. and the lack of one single state leader state that would claim that leadership. And people were hoping that based on that anarchy, we could come to some harmony. We have the UN Security Council, the five nuclear superpowers that sort of globally can control the situation between themselves. But the events have shown that this harmony most probably will not continue for too long. Two countries have certain potential for revolutionary changes in the world. I mean, the US and China, both the US and China have resources and opportunities to demand revolutionary changes in the world to overcome this anarchy as we come up with this new world order. The problem is that these countries compete, and the world order that both of them offer are mutually uh, are incompatible. And so we have this fight, this clash between American approach and Chinese approach, and it's going to be even more dangerous than what was happening under the Cold War. It's more dangerous because in the past the USSR and the West interacted in a rather narrow sphere of rather narrow sphere, and there you could manage it by phone. China and the US have many more areas of conflict, and the escalation potential is much higher. And the second threat is that other countries will have to make a choice in that conflict, which, from our point of view, is rather threatening and dangerous for international security. My colleagues and I have realized that after 1945, when the UN was established and the Security Council, the humanity never invented anything better. And these five nuclear powers are much stronger than all other countries. And it's only fair that they have some privileges, even though the UN system is quite fair and just for other countries. And so far, my colleagues and I could not come up with anything better in terms of international relations. But there's a threat against the UN system, including from this bipolar clash between the US and China. So that we need to preserve this anarchy in the good sense of the word, and to keep this global level of security would be what all of us need. At the same time, we need to be creating institutions that would be relevant in the current situation and would have some moral authority, which is not connected with one's military or economic might. That's why we're talking about cooperation in healthcare, in fighting the pandemic, because now we have an obvious example when such a problem can unite people of the planet just as good as hypothetical aliens. Thank you, Fyodor. Okay, thank you. We'll get back to your idea about anarchy in the good sense of the word, because it's always debatable. And now let me point out to you that the report is not just about potential confrontation between the US and China. It's quite extensive and diverse. We are analyzing in detail social aspects of those changes, all those changes in the relations between societies and their governments and states. It's a separate topic, but today we want to focus more on the political component. Okay, also with us we have another important guest, Sergei Repkov, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. He is a great friend of the Valdai Club. Thank you for coming to our events so often, and this time we are particularly grateful. We can write all reports that we want. We are quite irresponsible, but you have to work in this world of anarchy in the good sense of the word. And at the same time, you're in charge of our foreign uh, policy together with your colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it would be interesting to find out what kind of thoughts you have about our report. Thank you very much, dear Fyodor and other colleagues. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to join today's debate, and to my colleagues who uh, are really experts in the new reality and who analyze it from different perspectives. Thank you for your introduction. And this is what I'd like to say. I would like to quote this phrase from one of the Soviet movies, anarchy is the mother of order, but I'm not going to, because there are many other different quotes in the report that are mentioned. You mentioned many different terms: global governance, sustainable development, and many of those terms are also criticized today. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we watch really carefully and monitor all the materials that are prepared by Russian political experts. And of course, these publications allow us to look at international problems from new perspectives. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Lukyanov, and your entire writing team for analyzing the impact of pandemic on the current system of international affairs. That's one of the biggest advantages of your report. And we will continue analyzing it and to see whether we can use it practically. Anyway, you were able to show and analyze this critical topic of today with the record-breaking speed, at least for Russian community of political experts. So it's obvious for us that the pandemic has become an additional catalyst of many processes in the context of transformation of the global order. Unfortunately, this new common threat did not lead to relaxation of geopolitical differences. It exacerbated ideological and information standoff. It's obvious that this virus led to the uh, drop or decrease of business activity, and we will only have to assess the results of that later. It really hit hard the global value chains, and this great lockdown will definitely hurt the global economy, even though its impact on specific countries will vary. And of course, one cannot help wondering how, in the face of this common grief, some countries, instead of looking for joint solutions, are playing the blame game, trying to search for the guilty. The loss of the Atlantic camp of its political, economic, humanitarian, and geopolitical leadership brings about this overgrowing temptation to use the old paradigm of solving one's domestic problems using enemies from without, so to speak. Yet another sign of this anti-Russian and anti-China xenophobia recently cultivated in some Western countries was the attempt to present the help which is provided by Russia and China to other countries, medical help, as a desire to use humanitarian aid to strengthen their geopolitical clout. We once again hear that these blames for some hybrid operations, our involvement in spreading false information about coronavirus. We are particularly concerned about the attempt to use the coronavirus topic as a reason to neglect or disregard international law to get tactical advantages, to getting even with disliked governments or geopolitical competition. In that sense, the world that we're used to is really crumbling in front of our very own eyes. The question is, what will become of it if this international political Darwinism, to quote from your report, will become a norm? I'm not sure that we will really be facing the most destructive forms of anarchy in international affairs and the life based on instincts, which allegedly the actors are beginning to use right now. The stability in the true sense of the word will still remain, in my opinion, and the world will not lose its ability to reach a certain form of balance, but in a political sense, we will have less stability and it will not be guaranteed to all. Speaking about the report, we are not sure that it makes sense to overemphasize the clash between China and the US so much. In our opinion, it's not about new bipolarity, but a more complex polycentricity where many different actors and factors are playing their role. Even though there is this temptation to use simple recipes of every man for himself type, the humanity can only go in a different way. I hope that the crisis will help the global community not to go wild, but to deeper understanding of the basics of today's development. It's a banality that today's threats cannot be resolved by any country alone. COVID-19 only proves my point. Fighting the virus can be done only based on multilateral interaction, and sovereign states, despite all those temptations to guard themselves with fences and barriers, have not lost that ability. If we talk about positive effects of the crisis, one of them is that sovereignty of countries is back, and we are now revising its value in all senses, in the political, military, economic, or any other sense. I agree with the idea from the report that we need to strengthen the UN as the only legitimate international body responsible for preserving peace. Um, any attempts, any irresponsible attempts to undermine the mechanisms of this organization and its institutions are detrimental for us as we try to solve the challenges that are common to all of us. Well, unfortunately, not so much was mentioned about our country and its role in the era after the pandemic. We understand this was not the goal of the report. You were just trying to analyze and uh, understand where the pandemic leads to. And the members of the Valdai Club were quite right when they analyzed the global crisis in their previous publications. I hope that our discussion today will help us to better uh, explain the logic of what's going on and perhaps focus on some gaps and problems that your uh, text is missing. I'd like to support another idea from the report about the importance of convening the summit of permanent security members of the UN Security Council initiated by President Putin earlier this year. It would be beneficial for the world if the leaders of those 5 countries either, once again, would confirm their adherence to globally recognized norms of international law, and UN Central World Order would come up with measures to fight the pandemic, to settle the regional crisis and conflicts, to reduce global military threat. Thank you for your rather interesting report in general. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Repkov. Speaking about Russia, you are quite right. We did not have that task. Moreover, as the editor of the final version, I would cross out everything that was related to specific countries. Our Valdai reports are more like a barometer of the global situation, which does not mean we cannot work in the specific directions. All right, as for according to your estimate, we shouldn't have focused on the danger of bipolar confrontation between the two countries. We do hope that you are right and we are wrong, but we think that bipolar confrontation in its new version of the 21st century will become even more senseless and destructive compared with what we had in the 20th century. Even if we are too gloomy and you see the real picture, well, that would be great. Since we're talking about bipolar confrontation, I'd like to ask Tom Graham, another good friend of ours. I'm not going to mention all his titles and positions. It makes no sense. He is an important diplomat and politician, a scholar, a professor at the Yale University, and one of the uh, co-workers of Henry Kissinger. And most importantly, he is the person who in every global situation keeps calm and uses a sensible and reasonable approach, which is particularly valuable. Many of us are prone to panic.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Спасибо за приглашение.
It is a real pleasure to be in Moscow.
У меня огромное удовольствие участвовать в этой московской дискуссии.
I want to congratulate the authors
Поздравляю авторов с этим стимулирующим докладом.
As I was reading the report, I found myself nodding in agreement.
Я его прочитал и часто кивал в согласии.
And I would say that is a sign of the very high quality of the report.
И это знак действительно очень высокого качества отчета.
What I want to do in my brief remarks,
но я хочу кратко осветить некоторые моменты из отчета и высказаться также по поводу прошлого и будущего.
Первый пункт.
Вы действительно правы. Пандемия коронавируса подчеркнула, насколько сегодня важно государство в современном мире. Пандемия носит глобальный характер, но отвечает на нее отдельные национальные государства. И это не удивительно. Люди ожидают, что их правительство и государство даст им свою информацию и организуют меры по борьбе с пандемией. Самый важный момент. Только государство, будь то демократическое, авторитарное или какой-то гибрид, может что-то требовать от своего населения, каких-то жертв в этой ситуации кризиса. Что также мы видим? Это то, что растет авторитет власти. И государство больше старается контролировать общество и контролировать экономику. Была ли эта экономика уже изначально более-менее централизованной или открытой, как в США или в Европе? Вряд ли государство легко откажется от этой власти уже после пандемии. И это еще больше усилит значение суверенных государств в современной ситуации. Следующий момент.
pandemic has exposed the myth of the
Пандемия,
international community.
она раскрыла нам, что идея международного сообщества – это миф.
The report is absolutely correct that the international
Авторы совершенно правы.
has been invisible or ineffective.
Во время кризиса мы практически не видели никаких признаков международного сообщества, международных организаций.
The G20 meeting at the end
Встреча
of
Большой
March
Двадцатки в конце марта,
was rich with high rhetoric.
там была
Том,
очень такая
прости,
напыщенная
пожалуйста,
риторика.
ты не мог бы
Very
включить
little
английскую
concrete
дорожку,
action.
иначе у нас тут проблемы со звуком возникают. Именно. Can you turn the English language?
Can I turn mine channel to English?
Yes, yeah.
Лучше будет.
I guess that's why you were interrupted by my translation in the Russian channel.
Okay. So what we've seen is an ineffective and invisible international community. As I was saying, the G20 summit was rich with high rhetoric, but had very few concrete actions to deal with the crisis. The United Nations issued an appeal for a universal ceasefire during the pandemic. It fell on deaf ears. And the World Health Organization has been more effective, but we must remember that China, for example, rebuffed its initial request to do an investigation of the outbreak of the crisis in Wuhan. And now the organization is caught in a battle between China, the United States, and other powers about its conduct. And that is only going to undermine its effectiveness. The third, and perhaps one of the key points, is that we have not seen any true global leaders during this crisis, neither individuals nor countries. Before the arrival of the Trump administration, many of us would have expected the United States to try to take the lead in organizing an international response to the pandemic, the way the United States did during the Ebola crisis in Western Africa in 2014 and 2016. But the United States hasn't done that. The United States has been focused almost exclusively on its internal problems, and no country or no individuals has stepped into the place of the United States as a true global leader. In fact, what we've seen is something that the report underscores, and that is the increasing competition between the United States and China that is going to have a dramatic impact on developments as we look forward. Let me end, as I said, with just some thoughts on the past and the future. Whenever we enter a crisis like this, I think it's natural for us to look for historical analogies that will help us understand the situation we're in, what the future may hold for us. The report points to the period before the First World War. I would also argue that that is the appropriate analogy for the current period, but perhaps for a somewhat different reason than indicated in the report. The point I would stress is that the change that took place in the late 19th, early 20th century really outran our imagination at that time. And I think the same thing is true today. The changes are outrunning our imagination, and for pretty much the same reasons. If you look back at the end of the 19th century, what we saw was the emergence of a dramatic shift in the global balance of power, with a rising Germany challenging Great Britain for global leadership, and a increasingly powerful United States waiting in the wings. Today we have a similar situation, with a rising China challenging the United States, and a much more assertive Russia operating on the global stage and undermining the foundations of a US-led international order in favor of a more polycentric order. Same thing in technology. The end of the 19th century, we saw these marvels of the Industrial Revolution that were changing the way people worked, the way they communicated, the way they thought, and it was the first wave of globalization. Today, we have the marvels of the information communication revolution, also changing dramatically the way we work, the way we communicate, and the way we fight, and reinforcing what has been a second wave of globalization, at least until the outbreak of the pandemic. And perhaps the third and very important point is this the technological developments and social developments at the end of the 19th century and today are changing the way we think about the relationship between state and society. And even more important than that, it's changing our understanding of what it means to be human. So if you look back at the late 19th century, the rise of science was undermining the foundation of religious belief, which had been a very important element in the coherence of many societies at that time. Today, we have a type of progress that is leading many people to question the ability of secular ideas to cope with the problems they're facing. And that has unleashed a wave of populism across the globe, in the United States and Europe in particular, and also has fed religious fanaticism. And so it's led to a very complicated situation. If you look at this in very sort of brief terms, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, a tremendous amount of energy had accumulated around the world. And this energy held the promise of unleashing the prosperity that we've actually seen today, expanding prosperity around the globe. But at the same time, these technological and geopolitical developments also accumulated a tremendous amount of tension that unleashed the ideologies that led to the 20th century being the bloodiest period in history, bloodiest and most brutal in history. And I think we find ourselves at a similar point today. We are in a period of tremendous flux. There are grave dangers that face us as we look forward. The pandemic has only underscored all the problems. And unfortunately, what we're lacking at this time is the leaders with the vision that can help us evade the types of catastrophes that the world experienced in the 20th century. So when I look at where we are, I see a wealth of opportunity if we can get through the crisis effectively, but I also see the lack of our ability to comprehend the full extent of the changes we're facing, and our ability to pull us together as both as countries and as the world as a whole in order to meet the challenge so that we get the promise without the catastrophes. So let me end on that optimistic note.
Thank you, Tom, especially for your optimistic note towards the end. Tom has mentioned the ideologies that became the result of major shifts in the beginning of the 20th century. And the 20th century was largely determined by this clash of ideologies, of one's views on how the governments and societies should be organized. And that was the main conflict of the Cold War era, not just in the military and political sense. And in our report, by the way, we express the idea that this possible future confrontation will be different because there is no real ideological clash between the US and China. Both countries, both societies live in a more or less similar capitalistic market economy paradigm. It's not that existential choice that was offered in the second half of the 20th century. It makes the situation even more interesting how it's all going to develop. That allows me to switch to our next guest, our dear friend, president of the Shanghai Institute of International Affairs, Professor Chen Dunxiao, who attended Valdai a number of times, and I hope he would come again when the lockdown is over. And the Chinese view of the situation is of particular importance than in the past. Professor Chen, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning. I'm very pleased to be invited to join this webinar and dialogue. I would also like to uh, extend my congratulations of your latest, most recent released report. I I read through them and read through the report, and I think that I share many of those seminal observation and very interesting points. Let me uh, offer a couple of points. Um, I think some of my points would echo the theme of the report, and but some of them may not. I have still have no clear a picture about what will be what will be a very clear picture ahead of us. I maybe will raise some questions at the end of my comments. In general, I think that COVID-19, as the report has mentioned clearly, I agree with that. COVID-19 pandemic has brought the existing dynamics and tensions of international order into a sharper than ever relief. But this pandemic is not an inflection point of history. It has accelerated intensified many of the dynamics of the existing history or ongoing trajectory, rather than reverse or reshape the course of today's world political and economic landscape, including declining the transatlantic centric international order, rising tensions between Washington and Beijing, and reconstituting the economic globalization, especially in terms of global production and supply chain, etc., etc. Having said that, what impressed me most following this pandemic is, I think that most impressive, there are two trends, two changes that we should pay special attention. One is the disruptive effect the COVID-19 pandemic has exerted on international power shifting or redistribution trajectory. Both the established and emerging economies have been hard hit. All countries would come out of this pandemic weakened with different degrees and durability. So the question is how different they would be. Theoretically speaking, those economies with more robust economic resilience, stronger social cohesion and governance at home, and more capable of international networking would be more likely out of the pandemic in a relatively less weakened. China has been at the forefront of the first round of battle against the pandemic, so its whole of the government and whole of society mobilization to fight disease have effectively controlled the spreading at home, and it's now on its fast track of reopening its economic and social activities. The biggest challenge, of course, is how it will deal with its extremely rocky relationship with United States. Most of the East Asian economics have been hit hard in the first round of outbreak, but now on a relatively stable track. More importantly, instead of a blame game, the pandemic has injected momentum for a regional and sub-regional public health cooperation, including China, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN. So if the pragmatism could be maintained in economic field of this region, the prospect of East Asia's revival after pandemic will be much more higher and promising. Both the United States and Europe have been hard hit and economically weakened by the pandemic. The question then is whether they could contain the spreading of disease while gradually reopening their economic and social activities. Nevertheless, we should never underestimate their resilience in the aftermath. However, this matrix of a resistant capacity bodes not very well for quite a number of emerging economies in particular, let alone a large number of developing countries, which are more vulnerable due to weak public health system and economic structure. In other words, the conventional understanding of the decline of the West and the rise of the rest may be called into a big question following this unprecedented economic upheaval and the ravaging impact. Without an international concert of collaboration responding to the pandemic and the global economic salvage, the rising trajectory of modernization in past 2 decades for a growing number of developing countries may be disrupted. So this is an ominous prospect for developing countries. This ominous prospect for developing countries would present a more economic recession and political instability for the world at large. The other prominent change, what I observe after pandemic, would be a rising tension between the calling for international cooperation on the one hand and more inward-looking and the rising nationalism on the other hand, as my previous my colleague has mentioned that, as well as echoed mentioned in your report. The growing US-China split will lead to a further fragmented global market and dysfunctional international institutions. But I think the chances are slim that the world will be divided into 2 rival subsystems, because other markets and forces, such as the European countries and other regional powers in Asia, are not ready to take sides in the growing US-China competition. What they want instead is more strategic autonomy or strategic maneuverability. For example, in Asia Pacific, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN members are hedging their bets, siding with both, rather than siding either with Beijing or Washington. On the one hand, they are reacting positively to Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy, but at the same time, they call for accommodating China, not excluding it, and participate quite actively into Belt Road Initiative. On the other hand, ASEAN is vigorously promoting RCEP, in which China is an important member. Japan makes clear that the CPTPP talks welcome Beijing as well as Washington's involvement. So I think that regional powers, including those in Europe, Russia, or Latin America, the balancing and hedging policy can help ease the tensions arising from the US-China split. My last point is that what will the multilateralism looks like in the future? Obviously, the United States has increasingly lost its interest in and capability, particularly under the Trump administration, of the leadership for providing public goods, either for stabilizing global economy or responding to global challenges such as climate change or pandemic. Beijing's capability and ambition for leadership has been also challenged or obstructed in many ways. So how will multilateralism evolve without a strong leadership? This is the question I raised. I think that at least there are 3 kinds of scenarios. One is maybe there will be more ad hoc coalition of the willing and the like-mindedness. The second scenario is that maybe we will see a more kind of ASEAN Plus model, which means that middle power, a group of middle powers, will initiate those proposals of international agenda, while be selectively supported or endorsed by the United States or China. The third scenario is, I think, similar with the ASEAN model, but also much more, I think, auspicious one is the G20 minus. That is not the United States or it is not China who initiate the idea or take the leadership of multilateral cooperation, but rather the rest will initiate those ideas. And then, again, selectively endorsed by Beijing or Washington in the years ahead. But whether this kind of a scenario of multilateralism will come true, I'm not quite sure. But let's see, waiting to see. I will stop here.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Your point of view, your approach is calmer. As for multilateralism and multilateral institutions, it is true we will see what happens, but so far what witnessing is discouraging. What's going on around the World Health Organization confirms the gloomiest forecasts. The structure that could have played the most positive role, the structure that we really need as a tool, is in the middle of a very tense ideological and political clash. WHO. If the same happens with other international multilateral institutions, then we can go too far there. Now, let me give the floor to yet another good friend of the Valdai Club, head of the ORF fund in New Delhi, Samir Saran. Tomorrow there will be a debate between the Valdai Club and your foundation. We'll have this bilateral discussion with your colleagues, but we are glad that you join us today too. In India, uh, it's already nighttime, right? At least what we see in the background, but I hope we can hear you. Okay, Samir, you may have the floor.
No, actually, first of all, let me thank you, Fyodor, for inviting me. I hope you can hear me. And let me also send my greetings to the minister. It was a pleasure to host him at the Raisina Dialogue a couple of years ago. Good to see Thomas and my friend from SIIS again. And I hope you all stay safe and we are all able to meet again in better times. No, it's not. It is nighttime, but it's dark because we are going through a Delhi storm right now. There's a big storm raging outside, and the lights have been shut off as a prevention, as a preventive means, or maybe there's a tripping somewhere, so the electricity has gone. But these are the times that internet remains and electricity goes, and we as humans still continue. So I guess that tells you a bit about the changes that Tom was referring to. We as humans now feed on different forms of necessities. And I guess let me start by building up on his three ideas. I think even before the pandemic and before your report, Fyodor, there were three obvious clues to most of us who were engaging with global governance and with politics more largely. One, technology was changing the nature of existence, our own identities, our own collective and individual aspirations and connections to our families, societies, countries, and people. There was an identity transition underway. The second, of course, was equally visible, that the social contract within the state, within the government and its people was changing dramatically. Public goods were being delivered by the private sector. Communication was all privatized. The whole idea of mobilizations was no longer the role of the state, but could be done by Twitter and social media hashtags. You were seeing a loud and continuous debate on how will the state and the citizen agree to a new treaty to continue in the days ahead. And finally, you were beginning to question the validity and the relevance of international institutions. We would all agree that UN at 75, which is this year, is a very, very old man. It is both failing and playing. And this pandemic, unfortunately, shines a torch on all three of these tendencies. Of course, these are not new. This has happened before in the turn of the previous century. Let me give you an incident from 100 years ago as well, because I think that's important. During the Spanish flu, the previous big pandemic in 1918, if I remember, families and friends took to the telephone. They used the telephone to connect with each other because they had to maintain social distancing. The telephone systems collapsed. The telephone systems in America could not keep up with the demand of people to use that facility. But the technology did not collapse. The technology stayed and changed our lives forever. The second wave of globalization that Tom mentions was driven, amongst others, by the digital and telecommunication revolution. What we are seeing today is the complete platformization of nations, the platformization of societies. Zoom has become the Munich Security Conference of today. It has become the Davos of today. It has become the new area where we convene, debate, the public sphere. Zoom is the public sphere. Microsoft Teams is where we hang out. The platformization is going to have a very, very deep impact. I think in the next 2 years, what our response and contest with this virus does to us as society will have huge impact over the next 4 to 5 decades. So let me congratulate Valdai Club on the report, and let me continue to urge them to bring out such reports, because the next 2 years will define mankind for the next 5 decades. And I think it's really important to be following these times. Now, there is very little to disagree with your report, Fyodor and Timothy and the team. I think you are spot on about international institutions. However, I think there is a degree of optimism that you believe that it can be saved and they can recover their relevance. I believe they are past their sell-by date. I think we are trying to use 20th century solutions for 21st century problems. I think either there is time for radical reform or a time for a complete new set of devices. My colleague from Shanghai possibly indicated a couple of those solutions: going ahead, a new form of plurilateral clubs and arrangements to tide over the interim period as we build global consensus to create more permanent structures. There could also be informal and quasi-institutional arrangements amongst large powers and middle powers, like my friend from China suggested. But I am not necessarily convinced that United Nations can be salvaged, that framework, or even if it is salvaged, it can do us too much good for too long. I think the time has come to do some radical rethinking around governance based on the 3 ideas that Tom alluded to and I have tried to expand upon. So that's the first point. I do believe bipolarity is important. And again, Fyodor, I would not be as negative on bipolarity as you are. As far as I'm concerned, the golden age of multilateralism was the bipolar age. I think we were able to create more international norms, laws, arrangements, treaties, and peace in the Cold War than we have been able to do in the unipolar moment. I think a single country or 2 countries who are not equally balanced will struggle to keep peace, will struggle to serve institutions, will struggle to serve the world. So I am also going to try to be the devil's advocate here and suggest that maybe bipolarity is not such a bad thing. A rising and a strong China and Russia and America may perhaps be able to play the role of the underwriters of global peace, stability, and order, which America alone clearly has been unable to do. And I think the end of unipolarity, which this pandemic clearly tells the story about, and Tom is absolutely right. In my close to 5 decades on this planet, I have not seen a crisis where America was not in the lead. This is the first time where the absence of America is palpable. It is the time when you realize how clumsy American leadership is, and also you realize how incapable the emerging power China is. Both of them do not have the capacity to underwrite peace, stability, and order, which this pandemic demands from global leaders. So there will have to be a collective, a coalition, perhaps maybe not the Cold War, Fyodor, that you are in a sense fearing, but maybe something I can take a leaf from my Russian scholars and suggest a hot peace, that we will have something like a hot peace that will define the 21st century. Hot for a simple reason, because I think the interconnectedness between American industry and American society with China is so deep that the decoupling will only be partial. It will continue to, the countries will continue to interact, trade, and conduct business, and yet they will continue to weaponize their interactions periodically. So it will be peaceful, in my estimation. It will be heated at many times. You will see ebbs and flows, and you will see weaponization of the relationship. But I suspect, like the Soviet sphere and American sphere, the clean division of the world in the future may not be possible. It is going to be more interconnected. It's going to be more gated globalization, as I have mentioned in a paper I wrote for you, Fyodor, last week. We are going to control the flow of globalization, but I believe that globalization as it exists is going to be very difficult to put back into the bottle. So I think that's one point around international institutions and bipolarity. I like the point about nation state. The state is back, but the state is back for what? And that is my worry. You have a strong state, but the strong state will have no comprehensive national power unless it is able to do global trade. and build resources and money and profits and change lives of its people and create development agendas if you're in the emerging world, or redistribution if you're in the developed world. I think the whole idea of a strong state was visible in the last 5-6 years. But at this time, you should begin to question that is strong state necessarily a useful ideology or concept to live with. For me, you will have strong political states with very little content within them. And I think the strong state with little substance is going to be the reality of our time for some time. Strong leaders are going to be representative of the strong state. I don't think the state will be strong in terms of dispensing governance, technologies, solutions, and services to its people. So there's a contradiction here. A strong political system, but not necessarily a strong nation, will be the characteristics of the time. I like your discussion around the agnosticism around ideology, or an ideology agnostic world. I think you are absolutely right. This requires far greater investigation. For me, tribalism has been masquerading as ideology. I'm not quite sure that we have coherent positions in politics and in society today. I believe Darwinism is perhaps the closest description, and your report gets it right, that we are, it's more about survival of the fittest rather than survival of the righteous. And I think that the ethical mooring that you speak of is less important than the political dynamics that are helping us decide our tribal identity. So I think tribalism rather than ideology seems to be the defining moment. And I guess in the age of demagoguery, tribalism will continue to thrive. The final point, I think this is something we need to think about. All throughout, we used to argue that trade is hitting a political wall. We used to talk about the fact that we can't trade more or can't be more economically integrated because politics was coming in the way. Whether it was TPP, whether it is RCEP today, whether it is digital agreements, whether it is many other integrative processes, we saw politics restrict economics. Economics was prisoner to political ambitions. I have a feeling that we have now reached that point where bad economics is leading to bad politics. Politics has hit the economic wall for the first time. In the last 10 years since the financial crisis and our lack of honesty in addressing the underlying social deficits, electricity is back. So, in the last 10 years, we have not really corrected our economic systems. Globalization has been perverse. The bottom third of humanity lives for 40 years less than the top 15% of humanity. Globalization has favored few. Since we have not corrected the economic assumptions and economic outcomes of our global integration, we are going to always incubate bad politics. And I think perhaps
The light was back on and they lost internet at that moment in India. If Samir can still hear us, thank you very much for your comment, for your contribution. Your metaphor of a hot piece is something new. They played a lot. They said Cold War, Cold Peace, but this is the first time I heard hot peace. As for India, India is probably the only country where internet can exist without electricity because they have this ability to concentrate spiritual energy. So their internet works on spiritual energy. I hope Samir will be back. Thank you to all. We have collected quite a few questions that we got. And to sum up, today, there was this news today which is directly linked to our conversation. In France, was this scandal around the largest pharmaceutical group, Sanofi, one of the largest in the world, is in the middle of everyone's attention when its manager, CEO of this group of companies said in an interview that they were developing a vaccine, coronavirus vaccine. They were hoping to get it in the foreseeable future, and he thought that the Americans would be the first to get it because they were the first to invest some funds in February. They were the first to invest into those studies, and they have this priority right thanks to that. That led to a turmoil and a wave of indignation in France. And at the official level, the ministry has said it's unheard of, and they cannot be defined by finances. They said it's definitely the French vaccine, and the French will have the priority. This is just an example. I'm not sure what will happen to it, but this is what we will begin facing, this contradiction between this cosmopolitan, transnational nature of capitalism, which is global, and at the same time, totally different perception of it from the states, from the countries, and even from the citizens who are no longer happy with this globalist explanation. This is what we were saying in our report as well. Here's what I suggest we do. I will be asking each one of you a couple of questions, and then we have quite a few of them. I will try to group them. All right, we'll start with Mr. Ryabkov. This is from Komsomolskaya Pravda, a newspaper. What is the position of what is the position of the Russian Federation about the US blaming China? Do we have an official position? And my second question is from another area. Russia has called the US many times to extend START 3 for 5 years, no response yet, and only less than a year until the treaty is still valid. How can we not go wild in that situation? Thank you, Fyodor. Do you want me to immediately start answering? Yeah, why don't you go ahead like that? As for your first question, we are concerned about what's going on in terms of the US blaming the People's Republic of China, our strategic partner. We have expressed our position on that topic. It is as follows. There is no reason to criticize China for doing something untimely or wrong or in an inadequate manner during the entire period of fighting COVID-19. There is no reason for that, and we expressed our opinion at the specific international platforms, and we called for the American authorities to be more responsible about financing the WHO and to stop trying to settle this geopolitical score. Unfortunately, the overall trend is going in the opposite direction. We can see how politicians and diplomats and the most responsible people in the executive authorities daily multiply their list of claims against China, trying to impose on the entire international community this anti-China discourse. I think this is not the way to behave in the situation when the entire world needs to set aside, and I mean countries of the international community, at least for the time being, they need to abandon their own selfish approaches, their own narrow ideas about what needs to be done, when and how, and to consolidate and focus on the platform to fight the pandemic on the one hand, on the other hand, to relaunch the global economy to keep it least damaged for all countries and for the entire civilization. As for the second question, it is true we still get no signals from Washington that could have been perceived as indicating that they wanted to extend the initial 10 years of treaty on strategic offensive arms when it's over on the 5th of February next year. This is one of the problems that we're facing in our relations with the US. We proceed from the fact that this treaty is something important, not just for the countries that signed it, but it is there for a good purpose of strengthening the foundations of international security and strategic stability in the broader sense. Yes, the situation is changing. There are many things happening in the world in terms of technology, and here I agree with my colleagues who spoke before me. A lot needs to be changed and reformed, but for all that, it takes time. We cannot get into this brave new world even if we have politicians with the vision we need, who would be visionary enough to formulate this prospect overnight. We cannot wake up tomorrow morning and see ourselves in this great new world. To build something, especially in the situation when between countries there's no trust at all, and the experience of previous decades is rather negative. And here I'm talking about the experience of past years between the US and Russia. Anyway, for diplomats and politicians, it will take time, if not to implement most ambitious ideas, but at least move forward on the ground in the more practical aspects of the current situation. Arms control is one such area. Based on the pragmatic approach, we would want to get some kind of time frame, time reserve, so that we could try to come up with something new that would be able to ensure predictability and stability in that sphere in the after start period. For that, we need to extend it next year without any preliminary conditions. This is what Russia is calling for, and which was formulated by President Putin in December last year. Now, Tom, it's your turn to follow up on what Deputy Minister Ryabkov said. In general, we understand that the current US administration is not inclined the extension of that treaty, but there will be elections in the US, which is unpredictable. But let's imagine that the Democratic Party candidate wins, and he represents the kind of administration that signed the START treaty in the early 10s. If Biden becomes president, is elected president in November, and takes office in January, can we hope that his administration will be willing to extend the treaty and will have time to do that?
Fyodor, the answer to that is I think, quite simple. A President Biden would support, I am fairly confident, a prolongation, extension of the START treaty. As you said, he was part of the administration that negotiated it. Many of the people who participated in that negotiation will probably return to responsible positions inside the government. From the standpoint of the United States, the extension of the treaty is a fairly simple matter. All it requires is an executive decision by the president. It doesn't have to be ratified by the Senate. So the president of the United States, with a single signature, could extend the treaty. I understand it's a bit more complicated on the Russian side, but certainly the president would be inaugurated on the 20th January. The treaty expires on February 5th. I would imagine in that time, the president Biden would find time to sign the executive order extending the treaty. And then I think the Biden administration would also be deeply interested in a substantive strategic dialogue with our Russian colleagues. As the minister has said, a lot has changed in the world. A lot has changed in the strategic context. At some point, we need to include China in the conversation. We probably need to include India in the conversation, a number of other countries. The strategic concept will have to entail a look not only at nuclear weapons, but cyber weapons, space, precision conventional weapons, and so forth. It's a big, complex issue, and we can only do this if we feel confident that we have the sort of one piece of the nuclear puzzle in place as we move forward.
All right, I cannot help addressing Professor Chen Densao. Can we expect then China, under certain circumstances, will be interested in this nuclear treaty discussion? And here is a question from our audience. In China, you are getting out of the economic crisis. In your opinion, can we expect restructuring of the industry with more green economy and reduction of pollution? Will there be a green reset of the Chinese economy? Can that be a response to the economic crisis?
Well, thank you, Fyodor. Also, thank you for the question you raised. I think that a very quick response to the previous question raised is whether China is interested into those strategic nuclear dialogue. I think that Beijing will be quite open to those multilateral dialogue on those nuclear strategic arms control. So this is my very quick response. Of course, this is a very complex one. With regard to the audience question about the green economy, I think that this is what Beijing in the past decade is one of the priority for Beijing to try to transform its economic structure to more green and sustainable economic development. And I think that if you check those consumption of those energy, and you will find that those green or renewable energy proportion of overall consumption has been increased quite gradually and in a steady way. And I believe that if you check those pollution barometers of all those big cities, you will see that for those cosmopolitan cities like Beijing and Shanghai, it already improved a lot, largely because the increasing number of, I think the government has introduced a new incentive to encourage the use of those electronic vehicle rather than to use the traditional energy driven car. So I think that this has been already one of the driving force and pillars for the economy of China. Thank you.
All right, our next portion goes to Mr. Ryabkov again. This is Kommersant newspaper. How hard can the UN be hit based on the attempts of the US to return to the anti-Iranian sanctions using the snapback mechanism. What can Russia do to avoid anti-Iranian sanctions? Two more questions from RBK, the news agency. Are there negotiations to form a high-level group on economic cooperation between Russia and the US? And what about the video conference and the date of the video conference for the members of the Security Council? We'll start in the reverse order. No, there's no date for the virtual online summit of the 5 countries of permanent members of the UN Security Council. This is planned as an event to consider COVID-19 issues and a number of related topics, but there's no date yet. It has not been approved yet, but it's on our agenda and we are working on it. We believe that there's some progress there already, but it's not enough to say that we are ready to agree on the content of such an event. As for bilateral US-Russia discussions of the economic situation, I know that you're aware of the fact that Russia a while ago at the highest level made an offer to our colleagues in the US to move in the direction of business advisory council that would be comprised of respectable representatives of business circles that would help their governments to look for the way forward in this difficult situation in our relations. And once again, we've been discussing this topic for quite a while, but unfortunately there's no progress. There are a number of obstacles in our way, including on the American side in their executive authorities. When we discuss this topic, they come up with certain conditions that are strange, to put it mildly, from our point of view. They are, frankly speaking, unacceptable. It's a deadlock. We are not making any progress, but I hope that in the nearest future we'll be able to move forward, because there is a need for such a format. There is a need for such a platform, and it's obvious. Let me also point out that most of American companies working in the Russian market do want to stay and work in our country and to continue this work and their operation. Of course, the pandemic situation has left its mark, negative mark, on what's going on. As for extending these limitations on supplying arms to Iran and the supply from Iran. Of course, we are monitoring what the American representatives are saying about the situation. We monitor the publications. We watch how it's being discussed in New York, where there's lively debate on that topic, even though the UN structures and the UN bodies have stopped functioning in the physical sense. But our approach to the situation is quite simple. The existing limiting mode against Iran will lose its force on the 18th of October this year, according to the corresponding UN resolutions. So when that was passed, the previous sanction resolutions of the Security Council had been cancelled. High-level representatives of the US administration and respectable diplomats representing this country, they are looking for alternative ways to keep those sanctions, including the one that was mentioned in the question. But our position is once again quite clear. No one can selectively, in a fragmented way, follow the UN Security Council resolution. The US 2 years ago have left the comprehensive action plan, which was approved by the corresponding Security Council resolution, and it became an important part of the set of obligations which, through that resolution, became legally binding. For 2 years, the US, in the situation of violating the US Security Council resolution, the material breach of that resolution, they are violating Article 25 of the UN Charter, which says that all countries of the world that joined this charter and are members of the UN should follow up on the resolution and of the Security Council. And in this situation, to claim the use of mechanism which is in that resolution is quite cynical, to put it mildly. I believe that this position is shared by the majority of members of the international community, and Washington is not to expect an easy way forward. Of course, there are all these debates that at the Security Council level, I still agree that there is crisis looming because of this strict position of the US. This is from news agency Politics Today. It's once again addressed to Deputy Minister Ryabkov, but I think it's not exactly the matter for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but actually I would ask every one of us to answer this question. Let me start with Samir, who is actually back with us. Okay, what is the possibility that the instruments of control mobilized by countries to fight the pandemic will be used to limit freedoms according to those digital dystopia scenarios, and now forever? This is important for regular citizens and for political analysts. Samir, what about you? What do you think?
I think this is a classic question of these times. Since we spoke about the strong state, we spoke about the state being the only legitimate actor at this moment. We spoke about the complete failure of international cooperation to provide any other means to individuals, communities, and citizens. We have tilted the scales in favor of regimes that are able to use tools that will currently, at this particular moment, help the citizens, but also curtail the citizens' rights in the days ahead. So I fear that technologies that are used today for contact tracing, for managing the spread of the virus, for containment strategies in the hands of certain regimes will be terrible for personal freedom and liberty. But I also feel that the threat does not come only from the state. I feel the technology companies themselves, the ones who are creating these technologies that states are buying or buying into, will also be able to exert a huge control. I mean, can you imagine? Now, let me give you an example, Fyodor, since you and I are part of the BRICS grouping, and Russia is the presidency, BRICS presidency at this time, for us to think about. The Brazilian president allegedly lied. he said he produced fake news. Let's assume this is true, just for the sake of argument. You have a private platform that decides to take down the statement of a Brazilian president. So now you have a private company that is censoring the speech of a sovereign head. And guess what? We are all celebrating this act. Great. We have prevented fake news. We have taken down content. We have allowed private sector company to censor a sovereign head. Think about it. Who is right here? I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is that don't only worry about the state which will use technologies to control you. Also think about the private companies that will decide what you hear, what you see, what you can speak, and how you think. I think the next few years, the citizen will have to fight very hard to reclaim some of the space he had made available for himself in the past few decades.
Samir was quite right. I recently came to think of it. The authoritarian systems are less traumatic in a sense because there only the state interferes with the private life of citizens. But in democracies, well, the state does it too, plus private corporations and interests. In our report, this is what we say. This erasing of these borders between authoritarian and non-authoritarian countries, the arguments are different, but the technology is the same. Mr. Chen Dunciao, China
Well,
is always shown as an example of a country where the technology of controlling their citizens are almost perfect. And there's a debate now, shall we borrow from China or not? What do you think? Is China ahead of us in that sense?
well, every country has its own experience and culture to deal with the balance between what you said, that's a freedom, privacy, security, public interest, etc. I think that particularly in a Chinese culture, and when we believe that the security or safety is a given, then there's a growing demand for more freedom and also high demand for a more protection of the privacy. Even if I think that a growing number of middle class people in those cosmopolitan cities like Shanghai and China, we concern a lot about whether those ICT technology development will increasingly intervene into our private life, and we're quite concerned about that. However, the pandemic, at least in the immediate futures, will change the I think those barometers of those people understanding that what is the best balance between those freedom and the security or safety. I think that when the pandemic is still ongoing, when there's still a possibility of a resurgency of the epidemic COVID-19 in China, either through those imported cases or through a cluster of new cases at home, average people would prefer the government to play a more strong and restrictive measure. And they also would believe that it is necessary, it's a necessity. So I think that it's a kind of like yin-yang, the philosophy of China. You have a negative aspect, but also you have a positive one. It's the two aspects of one coin. And the different country, different culture will have a different understanding of this balance. There's no so-called best practice. There's no so-called a one-size-fits-all model. So I think that you are right that when we talk about those, which country is more capable to deal with those pandemic and prevention and controlling, it actually has nothing to do with those democracy or authoritarians. It all depends upon whether this government is much more capable in mobilizing the whole society or government in responding to that, and whether the average people, I mean the general public, would follow those rules or regulations issued by the government, and whether those resources could be much more well mobilized and allocated to the people or areas which is most desperately needed. Thank you.
Tom Graham. I had a friend in school who's been living in Canada for quite a while, and he wrote to me about what Donzel just said. He was shocked how readily people around him in Canada, citizens of one of the most democratic countries of the world, were willing to give the right of control to the government so that it could ensure their safety and health. That's the Canada, but what about the US? In the US, it's one of the foundations of your country. What do you think? Is there a risk that the Americans will want to sacrifice their freedom for the sake of health and security?
You know, Fyodor, we have a very sort of paradoxical situation in the United States. Certainly, there has been a public demand for effective organization of a response to the pandemic across society. We want the federal government to be involved. We want the state governments to be involved. We want them to coordinate. And part of this will require greater surveillance, greater monitoring, contact tracing going forward. But it's also the situation that there's a great deal of distrust in government at the same time in the United States. So on the one hand, we want the government to do more. On the other hand, a substantial part of the American public doesn't trust the government to do it properly. And you're going to continue to see that tension in the United States going forward. There is, I think, a deep awareness of the dangers of concentrating too much power in Washington. We've had a long history of that. There's also a growing awareness of the dangers of concentrating too much power in the technological companies, particularly the Silicon Valley companies. But we also have a very healthy and robust civil society in the United States. And the challenge, I think, for the United States going forward is to how to find the balance. How do we provide the government with the tools that it needs to provide for the protection of the health of our society as a whole, but how do we ensure that the government doesn't abuse that power? Same thing is true of the technology companies. An important element of our economy, tremendous amount of power, exercise of private power without public control. How are we going to balance that going forward? It's going to be a particularly robust discussion in the United States in the next couple of years because a number of developments, not related to the pandemic, but related to, say, the Russian collusion story, for example, have created a lot of concern as to whether the instruments we had in place to control the government, to ensure that it doesn't abuse its powers, in fact, are effective. So I think we'll end up with a balance. We've always had a separated powers in the United States. We've always, as a society, opposed large concentrations of power in any one place. But it's going to be a long, I think, and a difficult discussion that will take us through at least the next couple of years.
Mr. Repkov, will digital dystopia prevent or help our foreign policy, or it does not matter?
Я услышал на английском языке digital dystopia. Я предполагаю, что вы...
I heard digital dystopia in English, but you want me to comment on that? Yeah, this question originally was addressed to you. I'll be helped to answer that. You gave me the time to think about the answer to a difficult question. Let me quote from your own report, actually two sections. This chapter is about the great equalizer. It is an interesting chapter. What many spoke before me many instruments of controlling the society which autocrats were criticized for are in demand in democratic systems. And below, you give another idea that there may be new forms of protest, social mobilization, signs of aggressive non-conformism, and which are particularly important in the period. Dictatorship will fight the freedom. Both of those in parentheses will hardly work on, depend on the forms of political reason. The temptation for control will be everywhere. Do you know, these are far-reaching generalizations. I think that the Valdai Club, with its intellectual potential, can devote a separate report to this topic, and we will be glad discussing it in any new circumstances that will be laid in front of us. But I agree with my colleagues that we are entering a totally new phase of perceiving the relations between individuals and the society. The political systems that play an important role are supplemented by the constantly changing role of the business and corporations that these corporations have, and the totality of these factors give us a new habitat, a new environment. Some instincts to hide in your own shell, which the report mentions, can be true for the society and for the individuals. There are certain challenges and certain new circumstances that increase the lack of confidence on behalf of the people. How should they behave? Social distancing. Can there be distancing between individuals and the government, the state, as a response? And how can it be compared with political systems? I'm giving you topics for analysis in the future reports of the Valdai Club. Thank you. It is an important question. In our report, we did mention that only on the surface. Individuals and the society and the government will have new forms of relations. That's quite possible. There's another question to Deputy Minister Ryabkov. It's quite narrow. It's from CBC Azerbaijan, and I will expand it a little bit. The colleagues are asking specifically about whether the current situation will impact the joint programs between Russia and Azerbaijan, but I will expand it a bit. Will the current crisis hurt all these bilateral relations due to what was just all countries are focusing on their own problems and some joint projects will be less of a priority? Thank you. I would break it down into 2 or 3 parts. The immediate negative impacts on the projects that were being implemented in the or are in the pipeline, and let me give you another analogy. What we see at the construction sites of Moscow in the last few weeks, most of those construction sites were stopped. They were left, and they were in the status as they were at the moment when that decision was taken. Such projects may be restarted relatively quickly when they are of mutually beneficial nature. Nobody can prevent us from continuing it. As for longer plans and debates, and here we need to look at the abilities that the countries will have to support such projects with all sorts of resources, the assessment of what is possible and what is not is still ahead of us. It's unavoidable that we will have certain prioritization, but for Russia, it will always be a priority as it interacts with its neighbors, friends, countries with which we are connected with lots of ties. Azerbaijan is our closest partner and friend, and I don't think that there will be anything negative overshadowing our experience and history. The plans will continue to get implemented after a certain pause. Let me use the fact that there's a question to the authors of the report. At the end, I wanted to respond to it myself, but here we have one of the authors as well. From Kommersant, a newspaper. We talk about erosion of alliances, but you mentioned Western alliances. NATO didn't do so well, solidarity in the European Union. Does it mean that the Russian-based alliances were effective in the post-Soviet space? If yes, give examples. Is Timothy not with us? Oh, too bad. Then another question to Tom Graham, even though it's connected to the previous one. What will happen after this crisis? How it will impact the EU?
I think that is a very good question. Certainly one of the things that we have seen during the crisis is a certain failure of the European Union to act the way one would have expected it to. We've also seen there a great deal of what we would call national egoism, countries looking after themselves, not providing assistance in the early stages of the crisis to those countries that were suffering more than others. We've seen a further division between the North and the South growing out of this crisis, building on the division that emerged most graphically with the financial crisis over a decade ago. So I think the European community is in a period of great flux, questions about the European project. What we need to see in Europe, if the project is going to develop and the integration is going to continue, is the emergence of a leader, a set of leaders that can provide the rationale for the further integration on the economic side, on the social side, and also on the foreign policy side. Merkel and her French counterpart, Chancellor Merkel and her French counterpart, used to be the drivers of that process. That is not working as well as it has done now. The French president Macron is trying to step in that place, but he can't do it on his own. So I think the European Union will experience or remain in a period of crisis, even as the pandemic concludes. Where it will end up is a big question. Some of the answer to that question will also depend on what the nature of the transatlantic relationship is, where the United States is in all of this. And that will change, I think, significantly if we see a change in administrations in Washington at the beginning of next year.
I don't want to add anything about the EU, how we see it from Moscow. Well, in that sense, we're out of the questions more or less. Let me briefly respond to two questions about the report. There was one about the alliances where Russia participates. Does it mean that the Western alliances were bad and other alliances were good? In the report, we mention NATO and the EU only because these are the most advanced and developed, deeply integrated alliances, the most integrated alliances in the world. You cannot even compare anything else with them. We use them as examples because even there we witness those trends of certain erosion. As for associations that we have with Russia's participation, as any associations, they are facing significant challenges, of course, and no one understands how to respond to that. But Eurasian Economic Community does not face such expectations of coordinated policy as the EU. It's a different level of how advanced those projects were, even in terms of their age. And another question that I got, I want to make it the last question, addressing it to all participants. Sergei Sementsov asks this question. You say that there's no ideological clash and the next Cold War will be less harsh. In 2014, there was no ideological clash. It's still led to a certain confrontation. This is what we say in our report. It says ideology played a role that gave structure during the Cold War. That's why we didn't have a hot war. It was not just about ideology, but ideology was one of the factors. And now we are in a situation of competition which lacks this ideological foundation. And that's why it's more dangerous, because it is true, and our experts mentioned that, it reminds us of what led to world wars in the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, let me ask all of you my final question. Is there any prospect for the development of international situation leading to new ideologies that would be pushing us towards confrontation or rapprochement? Let me start with our Chinese colleague.
Well, Virgo, I think you raised a very important question, but I do not believe that there. On one side, we did see on the horizon of those tension, of the tension or the clash of the ideas, the norms. But I think that largely it reflects the one of the serious problems today in our international society, including among our academic circle, that we always, when we talk about those specific issues, we would rather rely upon a singular narrative rather than to prefer a kind of a multiple narratives. I think that we should challenge ourselves to try to put forward the notion of the multiple narratives for the global discourse to replace the one-size-fits-all. That is very important, because I think that first, the pluralistic modernization itself is not only the prominent feature of the current international order, but also a driving force behind its evolution. And secondly, I think that when in the world of Anthropocene, the multiple narratives are the prerequisite of a new international order that is inclusive and symbiotic. Single narrative has long dominated discourse on the international relations. The politician and international relations theorists have either predicted that China, America, for instance, with the vast differences in history, culture, and development model, will fall into a Thucydides trap, or describe their ideological rivalry in terms of democracies versus authoritarianism. But in a highly interconnected and yet vulnerable social and ecological systems, the common goal for all nations is how to mobilize countries with different development models and political institutions in a concerted effort to address the proliferating traditional and non-traditional challenges, such as climate change, pandemics, digital divide, and inequalities. So I think that if we just possess ourselves with those single narrative, it will not help us to have a better understanding of much more complex and interdependent, but still a very vulnerable social ecological system in which we are now which we are now living. I will stop here.
Thank you, Samir.
I'm not very confident that I really understand the current processes that are underway. I do know that we are going to possibly find ourselves in a very different space in the next decade. What has been unleashed through this pandemic could be quite profound, and we may not be able to predict where we emerge post this crisis. But let me try and just suggest three ideas. The first, I think the challenge of identity and narratives is going to be as much internal as it is going to be in terms of international relations. Countries and communities will have enough to do to create harmony amongst within their own territories and borders. And I think the challenge of creating any single set of overwhelming identification is something that I can sense ahead of us. I do not believe in this age of digital identities we will be able to have any single idea last either temporally, which means over time, or having the scale and legs to cover a large set of people. So I think we are going to see a fragmented identification, a world with multiple identities, and like my Chinese colleague suggested, I think the aggregation for the future will have to be based on managing this multiple identification matrix that many of the citizens in the world will find themselves within. So that's the first idea. The second, I think, is that the larger, there will be a little bit of a residual effect. We will still see a trust play a very important part. And I think for the next decade, after we are beaten by this pandemic, and all of us are going to come out quite weak, and I again agree with the previous speakers, we are going to cling to the familiar. You're going to see a period where people are going to seek familiarity and trust, and they are going to reach out to those they believe in, even if they believe falsely. They are going to seek familiarity. So I believe that trust will be one big currency in the next decade. And I do believe you will see old aggregations try to revive themselves. I'm not sure they're going to last, but I'm going to put my neck out, and I'm going to say that next year, once the new president of the United States comes in, and I'm again putting my neck out here, you are probably going to see a whole new oxygen in the transatlantic relationship, and you're going to see a whole new attempt to build a consensus around the liberal order. And if we don't see that, I believe the transatlantic relationship will be one between Beijing and DC, and not between Brussels and DC. So if that does not happen, then the transatlantic power on this side of the Atlantic will be Beijing, and they will be defining what Super Asia does with North America. And the third and final point, I think, which I wanted to say in my previous remarks before the internet failed me, I think the swing state here is Russia. And any report that discounts Russia's own identity challenges in the days ahead is a report that is being extremely careful in terms of not seeming to look partisan. I think Russia has a very simple question to answer. It has a moment when it can actually participate in the end of the liberal order, something it has detested because it was an American-led order. It has the opportunity of a lifetime that I can finish this American-led liberal system once and for all. The pandemic gives Russia that opportunity. Then what? If you destroy the American-led liberal system, if you destroy the Europe you once coveted, whose corner are you going to be standing in? And I think that's the Russian dilemma. That if you are with the Chinese to end the liberal order, then you have to live with the Chinese being a rather cute cousin of the Beijing, of the Middle Kingdom. So I think the Russians have an identity problem that is going to also play an important role in how the future plays out. So maybe ORF can partner with Valdai and do a report on the Russian decision in the next decade. Sorry,
Excuse
Tom.
me, I have two finger. You see, I want to, just respond to our Indian colleagues' view that I believe that when we talk about the so-called liberal order, it actually, there's no so-called a one or a single liberal order.
I agree.
It's
I
a
agree with you.
complex.
I said American-led. I used the term American order. I didn't
It's a
say
liberal international orders. It's a plural term. It's 2 minute orders here.
Yeah.
Right? So
No,
there's
I was
no
referring
one
to.
order.
I was only referring to the American-led liberal order. I was not referring to others. I was not referring to the BRICS-led order or the SCO-led order or the
Yeah.
SALED
Okay.
order. I was referring to American-led order.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sorry, Tom.
Okay, Tom, since we're talking about American liberal order, you may also have the floor.
Well, actually, I find a lot to agree with in what my colleagues have previously said about this. Certainly the United States made an effort to universalize its idea of the liberal order after the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it didn't succeed in doing that, in part because, as my colleagues have pointed out, the world is too diverse for that. There are different sets of values, different ways of organizing societies, and each of these works in a different way successfully for most countries. And the real challenge going forward is how we're going to reconcile all of these diverse views. How are we going to integrate the various orders that do exist already into a larger, truly global order that allows us to deal with the common challenges that we all face. Climate change being at the top of the list, but obviously pandemic diseases. What will we learn from the experience of the COVID-19 that will allow us to deal more effectively, both at the national level, but also the global level, with the future pandemics that are inevitable, and there are a host of other transnational challenges as well. So, picking up on what has been said, the question of identity is a big issue. It will be a issue that is acutely discussed within countries, also on the global stage. I think we'll be surprised in many ways as to how that turns out. Although I still think that the primary repository of loyalty for most people will be some sort of state or country, even though they'll have the possibility of communicating across borders much more easily than previously. I do think that there is and I would agree with Samir on this, there's a large role for Russia to play in helping to define what the order will look like going forward. I think the order that the United States wanted to lead is under stress. We need something new. And so what role can Russia play in thinking through what the contours of a order that in fact reconciles these diverse views will look like? And the final point I would make is that one of the things that comes out of this crisis that actually may be of tremendous help is because we all have to work remotely. In fact, we're communicating perhaps much more effectively and much more frequently across borders than we would have otherwise. We've all been forced to Zoom. You couldn't have done a conference like this, or you wouldn't have thought of doing a conference like this just 3 or 4 months ago. We try to bring everybody together in the same place. But this is a great platform for actually raising these ideas, bringing in multiple viewpoints, and undertaking the large challenge of trying to think collectively of how we manage what are important differences and critical differences across society so that we avoid the most catastrophic outcomes of the period of immense change that we find ourselves in now.
Mr. Repkov. As you see, whatever we're discussing, the result is it's up to Russia to define the future world order. I had a feeling we didn't want to do that, but that's what they are expecting from us. What do you think? Responding to the original question, the clash of ideologies in the future is possible. We look into the past, we study the present, and we know what ideological systems existed and keep existing, how they competed in the past. We understand it quite well. As for Russia, without generalizing, let me emphasize that we don't have such a problem as looking for our own identity and defining it. We have formulated it a long time ago at the level of doctrines in the document. It's the place of Russia in today's world, its role, the values that we are defending, the methods that we are using to do that, and we are quite open about it. Competition of values will intensify, in my opinion, and we have something to offer to the world. Russia's own identity, Russia's way, our adherence to protecting our sovereignty, our unity, social unity is with us. And I don't think that such some unfriendly countries towards Russia that exist could challenge that fact. If it's really a discussion on the level of external politics. Let me also say that we are open to interact with anyone who is willing to interact with Russia. It's not foreign policy willingness to agree with anything. It's our understanding that the world of today does require cooperation in the pragmatic sense. And we don't want any ideology here in the bad sense of the word. All right, thank you. I'm thankful to all our guests. Tom was right when he said, on the one hand, the pandemic separated us for quite a while. On the other hand, there was never such intensive communication in the past. And the events became literally transnational. In the past, you had to come, take an airplane. Of course, it has not replaced the old system completely. Let me also recall the metaphor used by Samir in his latest comment, is that trust now is the most important currency. It is true, it became evident a while ago, and in the crisis it became particularly evident. It's the trust trust in international politics, which is doing really bad, and it's trust between people that we required in that situation. It is trust between the society and the government, the state. There are lots of questions here as well. We mentioned them in the report, and there's a lot of work ahead of us. I mean, us as people who are trying to think about it, and diplomats as those who implement that in practice, and the politicians, everyone. And I'm really thankful to all those present here. I hope that our debates will continue. We will continue writing on individual topics from our report. The report is available at the Valdai Discussion Club website in English and Russian. We will be glad to get any feedback. Thanks a lot. Thanks to the viewers and the experts